We point to things like, well, wages rose as well, but not so much relative to, say, the cost of groceries, which are up 25+%.
Totally. By the way, this is a really key point. The difference between nominal and real inflation. After the financial crisis, the textbook says lower interest rates to nothing, and that will stimulate activity. Well, yes. But it turns out that most of the startups have not been able to raise any capital. So it's all based on the fact that your lower interest rates implies that banks are lending into the economy. But banks not only stopped lending, they don't even have any lending officers. They don't fulfill that function in the economy anymore. You know, I really do think that human beings are our most undervalued asset. And people are capable of extraordinary things. And they're so empowered now with AI and, again, everything on a supercomputer that's in your hand. And they're figuring out how to generate cash flow. And I see this.
All right, so Mike Green, I am here with Pippa Malmgren, and we are down at the Collective in Kiawah Island, South Carolina, hanging out in front of a swimming pool. Nice. You look spectacular. I look like a schlub. But this is a couple of days of vacation in South Carolina, and we're going to follow up this conversation with a few dinners and everything else. Pippa, the world is coming in your direction. I mean, if there was ever a debate about whether it's about economics or economic policy or corporate actions as compared to politics and political theory and the constraints around that, like, it feels like that world has been resolved in your favor, that this is increasingly about politics.
Yeah, I remember I wrote a book about 2017 called Signals, where I said, geopolitics is going to make a massive comeback and inflation will come with it. And at the time, everyone's like, geopolitics is done, the West won, we're over that, and inflation is gone. And in that time, everything that I expected to happen has really unfolded. What I find super odd is why other people didn't also see this. And that's sort of what I struggle with now. The good news is that in spite of how noisy and difficult the current environment is, I see immense solutions on the horizon. I'm very optimistic about where the world economy is going, but it's super noisy. And disentangling the noise right now from the opportunities is hard because people are very emotionally tied up in the noise, I'm finding.
Well, so as somebody who also saw the inflation probably more in a practical sense kicking in 2020, right? So May 2020, as oil prices have gone negative and rebounding, like, you know, you're going to get measured inflation, right? Something from negative is a big number increase, right? So you're definitely going to see that flow through. I will tell you that part of my pushback on that has always been the underlying demographics, right? That we're looking at a world in which the idea of true scarcity and true shortage is really hard to obtain relative to time periods we've seen in the past, for the very simple reason the population is just not growing very fast. I'm not sure what's going on. It sounds like we got alligators moaning in the background here.
Exactly.
You know, so like I look around the world and like Italy just announced less than 1% inflation, right? Like that feels pretty transitory to me, right? China is well below 1% inflation as they try to re-stimulate, and their real estate markets look like absolute garbage, right?
Terrible.
The United States, even if we look outside of the very lagging housing components, every other category of inflation is running levels that are well below target, right? So almost every other category. And in particular, things like goods, which are kind of the ultimate measure of shortage and scarcity, they're actually deflating at the fastest pace we have on record, right? Even deeper deflation than you have in the 1930s. At the same time, it's really hard to ignore things like tariffs. It's really hard to ignore a world that is basically dividing along, let's call them BRICS lines, just to make it simple, but we all kind of know what that means. Is the political component going to be the source of inflation? Is it going to be the breakdown in those trading relationships that you're focused on? Is that the historical example that you're emphasizing? Or?
Well, I'd say first let's also make a distinction between what do the official numbers tell us, which is what you're focused on, and what are people feeling, and what are they finding when they try to fill the fridge?
Okay.
There's no question. For example, here in the U.S., one of the driving factors in this economy right now is people are angry about their rising cost of living. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, they're not imagining that, right? You look at any grocery bill, it's gone up for sure. University fees, most things that we care about in daily life. So we've always had this tension between the Federal Reserve that basically says you're kind of imagining it. It's because you don't really look at the numbers. You're not calculating the fact that the value of your iPad has gone up dramatically and you only pay the same as you used to. But you're like, but I don't use the extra capability on it, so therefore it's meaningless to me. But we don't even get into that conversation. So I think there's a gap between how people feel and what the numbers say. And I don't want to leave it as just it's a feeling, because that makes it sound like you really are imagining it. I think, as an example, China and Russia very deliberately set about causing certain price hikes when they started the war, when we all started having war in Ukraine. In other words, it's very easy to think that's about tanks rolled into Ukraine and it's about territory and it's an old-fashioned land battle. But I don't think that's the situation. And if the Russians had wanted to shut the Ukrainians down, they could have done it. Why didn't they do it? Because much of the objective had nothing to do with Ukraine. It had to do with making oil prices globally higher, because that's painful to the West. And they picked a time when we were super vulnerable already from massive debt deficits and inflation had already begun. So it's like hitting a ball when it's already in motion. So I think then our regulators, of course, want to say, well, this is an aberration. We can't, that's not real. This is a temporary exogenous factor. But it's not a temporary exogenous factor to the person who then tries to fill the fridge, and it's too expensive. So I've long argued, we've got to distinguish between our, very technical, hedonic-driven calculation methodology versus what a regular person faces on a day-to-day basis. And again, it's the feeling matters, but it's not imagined. It's a real phenomena. So globally, by the way, I agree with you. The long-term trends, I'm deep in tech innovation, and there's so much tech innovation going on. So I'm not worried about inflation for the longer run, but it's certainly a real factor right now.
Well, it's funny. You mentioned the longer term factors, in particular things like AI or technological innovation. And I was at a dinner with Jim Chanos the other night, and his observation was technology is a bitch, right? It's it's very hard to stop people from improving processes and getting their costs lower. But if we look at, like Ukraine, for example, one of the largest producers of wheat around the world, if I look at wheat prices, winter wheat in the United States got down to the lowest levels in, I want to say, 35 years in terms of the actual price of the wheat. Now, no question that when I go and I buy my Wheaties. And your bread. And my bread and anything that has value-added component, very different story. Very different. I actually track, so I love to cook. I think this, and so I do all the shopping in my family, and I watch the oil prices. I watch the egg prices go higher and the milk prices go higher, et cetera. It does feel like we saw that outward shift, right? The prices definitely went up, and now they've kind of normalized, but a much higher level. Yeah. And the other component that you hit on, I think, is that we seem to have been very dismissive of the perception that this has become very hard, right? We point to things like, well, wages rose as well, but not so much relative to, say, the cost of groceries, which are up 25+%.
Totally. By the way, this is a really key point. The difference between nominal and real inflation. Yeah. And, in the 70s, it took people a decade to figure out the difference. They'd be like, I got a 25% wage hike. And you're like, yeah, but your cost of living has gone up 30, so you're down. What? You know, it really takes people a while to figure out that they're losing. And I think that has happened in this period as well. That's why we've just seen the longshoremen and the Teamsters striking. Like, we'll just shut down all the ports in order to get a wage hike that starts to be commensurate with what's actually happened in my home.
Well, one of the things that I'm seeing, and so Goldman Sachs just ran an analysis for me in which they looked at and basically said, what the analysis was, is what is the median wage bill for the S&P 500 by sector, right? And across the S&P in total. What would you guess the wages as a fraction of revenue was on average for the S&P 500?
Wages are just down.
Exactly.
Yeah, because you need fewer wages to do more work.
And in fact, we actually see now, this is one of the reasons why I'm still leaning towards I think things are much worse than people think, because we're actually seeing the productivity increase that has been a hallmark of every recession that we've seen for the past 30 years, right? Yeah. Which is, it becomes very hard to measure these things when you think in terms of, it's easy to think in terms of, all right, how many cars roll off the assembly line and how many people hours, late man hours went into producing those cars. And so it's really easy to improve that sort of process, right? But as you move to a services type business, if there's only one teller at the bank, I'm just going to wait in line slightly longer to see that teller, right? It's not meaningfully going to, in fact, what we see is a pattern of increasing productivity when layoffs begin in recessions, because you lay off the least productive members of the labor force. You replace them with those who are now afraid of losing their jobs, or you supplement them with the additional hours from those who are afraid of losing their jobs and willing to work harder. So it does feel like we've definitely gone through a component of that. But, even if I look at that component, it doesn't do a great job of explaining what's transpired, because I would argue the Fed has actually, this is something I wrote about in my Substack very recently, the Fed effectively targets wages as causing inflation, but doesn't consider corporate profits as considering inflation, right? So corporate profit margins, when they go higher, that's a good thing. Corporate profits going higher, that's a great thing. And by the way, I realize I sound like a communist. That's not actually what I'm trying to do.
I hear you.
But wages don't, right? And so this actually runs into a control theory framework where if wages go up, you hike interest rates to try to slow the economy, try to slow demand, force alternative, solutions and choices onto things. But if you don't do the same thing with corporate profits, you actually end up with exactly the pattern, right? Control theory would tell you wages will get pushed down, profits will get pushed up as a percentage of GDP.
You're totally right. And I think this is an even bigger issue. Like, for example, after the financial crisis, the textbook says lower interest rates to nothing, and that will stimulate activity. Well, yes, but it turns out that most of the startups have not been able to raise any capital. So it's all based on the fact that lower interest rates implies that banks are lending into the economy. But banks not only stopped lending, they don't even have any lending officers. They don't fulfill that function in the economy anymore. So strangely, there's like a disconnect. And so you don't allocate capital, in spite of flooding the market with capital, to the places that are going to generate the most productivity gains, innovation, real jobs. And also, like when you tighten because of inflation, you are actually then further depriving the startups that are taking the risks. And so how much of the economy is startup land versus traditional, S&P, Dow Jones? And I would argue the startup space is more important to the pathway into the future. But nothing in monetary policy is about that. That's just a side effect.
It's presumed. It's presumed that is a status quo, that's not something that we should ultimately hit. And the language that you're using, right, is basically an extension of the Phillips curve, which is, wages drive wage inflation. The presumption is that wage inflation in turn drives inflation. To answer the question about where wages are for the S&P 500, 17% of revenues is now the median wage bill within the S&P 500. It basically tells you that wages are not driving anything, right? I mean, their wage bill is almost the same as their profit margins at this point, right? What we're really seeing is a very different construction. And the second thing that I would hit on is that, when you start talking about it in the context of the Phillips curve and the beverage curve and all the components that effectively translate to how this is supposed to impact it, there's actually a really interesting analysis that was done in 22 by, I think it was the New York Fed, that looked at this underlying component of what actually is the impact of interest rate policy on the economy. And there's basically two paths that it's supposed to impact it, right? One is it's supposed to modulate demand. So I react to a higher interest rate by saying, well, I can't really afford that house, therefore I'll accept less, right? So I reduce my aggregate demand. One of the points of the authors is actually, interestingly enough, that if you instead think about that reaction function as a function of the level of assets, right? Perversely, what you end up with is those who are asset rich actually see the income off of their assets rise enough that they should increase their consumption in every period, whereas those who are asset poor and are therefore forced to make that deferral statement actually find themselves further and further behind the curve. And it really just unfortunately feels like that's this K-shaped bifurcated economy that we've experienced.
I think this goes to something much deeper even still, which is this idea that the Fed and all central banks are supposed to go after, they're supposed to keep money steady. And the reason is because they're supposed to balance the interests of the savers and the speculators. But what happened is they chose to support the speculators, especially in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And they kind of consistently go with the speculators these days. And I understand why, because the speculators are the ones backing the innovation. And the Fed feels we're in a race between innovation and inflation. So if they can just keep the innovation going, that stops inflation from being a problem. But this is, you could think of the balance between them as also an instrument of social justice. And there's a Swedish economist who was writing about this in the early part of the last century.
Probably not Wicksell, but...
Knut Wicksell.
Yeah.
Knut Wicksell. And I think that we have to consider what have been the social consequences of choosing to make the savers pay for all the losses and giving the speculators a free pass. And we're still dealing with the aftermath of that. And then not only that, but I think we still have a big problem because we've really got the Greenspan put on steroids these days. We have a Fed that it wants to tell all of the speculators in the market, you don't need to worry about anything. Nothing bad is going to happen. We're going to tell you way in advance before we even think about doing anything in the future. And this has messed up the yield curve. The yield curve, it basically, you're not able to adjust for the future risk of money versus today because you're like, yeah, well, whatever. There isn't any risk.
There will never be a shortage.
There will never be a problem because the Fed's told me there will never be a problem. This, you know better than I, how badly that messes things up. And so the question is, how do we get central banks to go back to what they should be doing, which is balancing the interests of these two extremes of society and forcing the market to manage its own risk instead of taking it away from them so they don't have to think about it?
Well, this is where, unfortunately, I think a lot of this overlaps with some of my work around retirement systems, what we're asking markets to do, et cetera, right? So if you turn the market into the retirement system, you can't leave it up to the market, right? Because the loss of a retirement system is just too great and too damaging to the societal framework. And so you force a reactionary Fed, right? You force a Fed that's forced to say, oh my gosh, this is, this plate is falling. Let's make sure we get that one propped up, and then let's prop up the other one, et cetera. And we are constantly propping those up without really even realizing what we're doing or why we're doing it in a lot of situations, right? So there's a lot of frustration. I see this on Twitter all the time where people are saying, let the system fail, right? Well, when you let the system fail, to quote from The Big Short, right, people die, right? We're talking millions and millions of deaths that occur in that result. I don't think anyone is quite as cavalier when they think about it in that context. But it does actually highlight that as a society, we need to figure out some way of disentangling that social framework from the market framework. And ultimately, I do think that more of that responsibility falls on the capitalist or speculator class. You know, we are going to have to figure out some better way of handling a lot of these transitions, because we really are. You highlight the amazing opportunities that are ahead, and the disinflationary or outright deflationary nature of many of these. I look at, the cost of accessing or, providing what are called tokens for calculation on ChatGPT. And my understanding is the cost is down by a factor of 100,000 in the past 2 years. Effectively, we've gone from an environment in which, think about it, the cost of getting in your car, driving to the library, asking the local librarian to help you search up some information, right? And then providing you with calling up a local professor and saying, what's your interpretation of these materials that I've looked up, right? Which it sounds crazy, particularly to young people today, but like that was the process of research that we went through in the 1970s and 1980s. And today I type it in on my phone, which happens to work wherever I am, and I plug it into ChatGPT and I say, what's the interpretation of this? And it comes back with something that's probably pretty close to as good as what that college professor would have told me, certainly when I wasn't paying them for that insight. But part of the question then becomes, well, what does everybody do?
Exactly. Well, so here's the good news. The entrepreneurial response function is so strong, especially in the United States. So when faced with all these messy politics, everybody goes, you know what? I'm just going to go build my own company and build my own future, right? When faced with the realization that the government may not have enough money to pay for your retirement, I'll just build my own retirement. When faced with the realization that longevity improvements mean you're going to live a lot longer, people go, I think I'll go back to work, right? The over 55s in the U.S. are still the fastest growing component of the labor market. So how do you solve the debt problem? Well, one way is you just go back to work. Now, if you tell people to go back to work, you're going to get riots, right? Not quite, but you're going to get social.
You'll get a lot of people that are upset.
You're going to get social
Maybe not
stress.
in the United States, but you are going to see work stoppages and all sorts of stuff.
But if people wake up one morning and go, I actually can go back to work. And it's not like the old days where you have to work full time for one employer. Now you're like a consultant to the company you worked for many years. You're working on a startup. Your mate has a startup. You figured out some ways on your iPhone to use Instagram to generate, or Amazon or something to generate some cash flows. And suddenly what people have are portfolio careers. And I think this is a massive change in the whole U.S. economy. It's also global, but it's, and I don't think we track this very well. I don't think we track the revenue streams, and I don't think we acknowledge how valuable some of these new sources of revenue are for individual households. I get a lot of people who say to me, you're so optimistic, but there are all these people who are just plain unemployable, right? And they'll refer to somebody who works at the checkout at some local shop. And I'm like, I really do think that human beings are our most undervalued asset. And people are capable of extraordinary things. And they're so empowered now with AI and, again, everything on a supercomputer that's in your hand. And they're figuring out how to generate cash flow. And I see this, things like, and it's a simple example, but my grandmother was a seamstress. And she came to the U.S. like 16 years old, nothing, didn't even speak English, and ended up as a very, very advanced seamstress in the haute couture industry. So today, I see mainly women who are designing clothes using AI and selling the patterns on Instagram. And you may say, oh, that's just very small. That doesn't really count for much. Yeah, but you make $5,000 a year. That's a substantial addition of cash flow to especially a low-income household. I don't think we're capturing either the economic value in our numbers or productivity, and I don't think we're acknowledging what a big deal it is that people can now make money without having to be employed by a major corporation. There are some hitches to this. In the U.S., I still find it really bizarre that it's so hard to access the healthcare insurance system unless you work for a major corporation.
Yeah.
Why? Wait, this makes no sense. But it's, I guess, a way of keeping people in a system, but it's not working. Everybody's becoming independent, self-sufficient, and they're doing amazing things. So this is a question of how do we get our economic data to catch up with the reality?
Well, I think there's two components to that I think are actually super interesting. One is that under ACA, right, remember we extended to 26, effectively the time period in which you could be covered under your parents' health insurance, working for that proverbial corporation, right? And so we actually, I would argue that we see this, and it's one of the things I love watching is the younger generation effectively have that hustle component that you're talking about, where they're like, wait, I can actually do this as a side gig. Unfortunately, typically from my parents' home, right? And, you know, under my parents' health insurance plan, but I get to do stuff that allow me to build skills or add to my knowledge base or add to my cash flow in a way that I might not have otherwise done. And they may work for that corporation as well. As you point out, the number of multiple job holders has exploded and is probably radically undercounted. Most of the data I've seen suggests that it's undercounted by about half, right?
That sounds right to me.
So I think the number that I've seen in the gig economy coming off of adding up the Uber and Etsy and TaskRabbits, et cetera, of the world, and I know I'm just picking a few randomly there, is somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 million versus roughly the 5 million, I think, that show up in the official reports. The flip side to that, though, is that need, right? So like the way you described it, I might even take a slightly different angle, which is to say, to me, the missing language in economics around labor has always been what labor actually represents, which is not so much supply as it is demand. Nobody decides that they're going to work unless they want to consume more or they want to save more. Right? Labor is the ultimate expression of I want more, right? And you can check out and be in a subsistence farm and save for your retirement by having 25 children and everything else, or you can participate in a modern economy, a modern aspect of the economy. But that requires an element of faith that the state is going to be there and allow you to participate and be there to protect you to a certain extent should your retirement run far longer or involve healthcare emergencies, et cetera, that you might not otherwise have had. That's why the Industrial Revolution was so innately tied up with this idea of social justice, this idea of retirement systems, this idea of social insurance, et cetera. It seems like we've lost that, right? Like we've lost a component of that discussion. It seems more like people are saying we all have to be independent, and yet we all want everyone to participate in this collective, which it is, right, economy. How do I reconcile those, or what do you see as reconciling those?
Yeah, well, I think you're right, but it's even bigger than that. It's just a breakdown of faith and trust that any of the promises will be fulfilled.
Yeah.
So this has led to a bunch of things. One is massive rise in the number of workers who are independent of large institutions, independent voters, because that follows, are record high levels. It's quite incredible. I think some surveys show as many as half of Americans are saying, I'm not Republican or Democrat. I'm independent of the whole darn thing. And yes, then what is your commitment to the system once you're out, as it were? And so there's a lot of questioning going on. And at the core of it is less what can I do for my country? It is, why has my country not done this for me? Right? That's where we are philosophically. And that explains a lot about where we are in politics, too.
It's a refrain that I think an awful lot about, right? So, I mean, if you were to have, let's pick a Kennedy that's running for political office, right? If you were to have Robert F. Kennedy Jr., or I'm sorry, RFK, but I don't even know which. I guess he is RFK Jr.
He's
right?
RFK, yeah.
God, I'm blanking, getting old. If he were to stand up and say, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, he would almost certainly be laughed off the stage.
Yeah, right now.
Right now.
Yeah.
And so that's actually exactly why I'm asking it. Like, why did we have such a different perception then? Was it because we had lived up to our expectation or to our promises? Because I'll be honest with you, I just rewatched Band of Brothers on HBO, right? One of the greatest film series of all time. And also the Pacific, right? And so actually the one I'm thinking about is in the Pacific. The last episode of the Pacific, they talk about the longshoremen's strike that occurred in 1945, 1946, as we came out of the war and everything was transitioning back over to the private sector, and the longshoremen did exactly what they're doing right now, which is to say, we want our larger share, right? Was it truly different at that point, or were we doing it? I mean, you understand what I'm trying to ask, right? What were we doing? Were we behaving differently? Or was it just a different ethos? Because a lot of the same components, the work stoppages, the disaffection, right? We forget the beatnik generation and the Dharma bums and, manufactured consent, which emerged soon afterwards as people open their eyes to, the propaganda of the Frank Capra type behavior, right? What am I missing that says why it was so different?
Yeah, I think the thing is that the period of history you're talking about, those were eras where you could go from nothing to everything. And there were many examples of people who went from nothing to the top of whatever their field was. My dad is an example in my own family. It came from a poor immigrant family and ends up being advisor to many presidents. Can that happen today?
Unlikely.
Unlikely. Now, why is that? Why is the opportunity set in front of us less than it was, even though the economy can deliver vastly more? This is a really interesting, social question. And I wonder sometimes whether it's ironically, I don't mean to keep taking things back to the Fed, but it's a little bit like, okay, once you said, all right, free money for everybody, then those with money used it to secure access. So like the university scandal where parents were paying to get their kid into university. So suddenly, if you didn't have that money, you couldn't get in. Like it had to be paid for. So what could we do to reverse this is the question. And widen the opportunity set. So I work with a lot of CEOs all over the world, and they are in the last 10 years saying, I'm worried about populism and social unrest. And I'm like, okay, when is the last time you hired someone who didn't have a college degree? No, we don't do that. Right. Okay, then you realize this is part of the problem, is you're not providing the avenues for people to transform from nothing to something. And they're kind of like, well, that's not my problem. I'm like, but it is your problem. And it is your problem. So if you're worried about that, why don't you find other ways? And by the way, this will be better for the company because then you get more diversity of thinking. I remember once I was briefing a law firm and they said, we're very diverse. We hire from 5 universities. And you're like, guys, seriously, and this has nothing to do with DEI. This is to do with different ways of thinking, of problem solving. So I think that's it. We kind of narrowed the doors, and we've said, you can't get in here unless you have certain criteria met, and that is the problem.
Well, Scott Galloway points out a fantastic statistic, which I personally experienced, right? So I grew up in California. To me, the UC system was a series of safety schools.
Sure.
Right? It was the admissions rate to Berkeley was close to 50%. The admissions rate to UCLA was in the 60s and 70s when I was applying. Today, those numbers are like 6 and 9 respectively, tiny. Right? So it's a tiny, tiny fraction. The demand for the service has exploded. combination of them becoming more international and certainly national in their structure. So you have students from all over the country as compared to just California.
Yeah.
But also exactly that phenomena that you're referring to. Companies largely ended their internship programs, their training programs, their apprenticeships died, et cetera. So all of that has gone away. But to your point about human innovation, one of the things that I'm loving watching, particularly with the younger generation, is watching them fire up YouTube.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
100%. And that is the kind of new education system, to the horror of the old education system. But yeah, these young people are educating themselves. And again, the AI revolution, potentially it's overhyped and underutilized and all that. Yep. But the fact is, it is empowering people to do extraordinary things that were never possible before. And so it rewards the curious. It rewards the open-minded. And it rewards in all age brackets as well. It's no longer, and all class brackets. It's no longer exclusive. So that is very exciting, but it's also like hugely disruptive. And I think the establishment, the system doesn't know quite what to do with this. But I think this is all, this problem also gets solved by back to the immense innovations on the horizon. So let me try a thought on you. So I think we think about all the exploration of Earth that occurred. Christopher Columbus sets off and crosses the Atlantic. So humanity, initially, we explored laterally. We went around Earth. Mm-hmm. Today, we are going up into space, where there are extraordinary innovations that are opening up to us. And we are going down into the subatomic structure of reality and genetics, DNA itself. Mm-hmm. And we are discovering new things and new ways of doing things that totally change the landscape. So you mentioned scarcity before. I see a world that's coming, it's full of abundance. I'm kind of with Peter Diamandis on that.
As am I.
Maybe in a different way than he argues, but fundamentally, the combination of supercomputing, converging with robotics, converging with AI, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. To me, the big problem is actually, how do you get people to stop working? I know that sounds crazy because they're like, no, I need to earn money, I need to do more. But here's the thing, we keep getting these incredible innovations. Do you remember John Maynard Keynes wrote that famous letter to his grandchildren?
Right. Economic possibilities for our grandchildren.
Indeed, where, he said, we're going to have all these innovations. You'll only have to work 15 hours a week and have the standard of living I have today. He was right, and that could be true. But we don't take those innovations and say, I only have to work 15 hours a week to have this level of income. We keep working 60, 70 hours a week. Why? Because we don't know how not to work. We don't know what to do with our energy, our time, our creativity. And we think it only counts if it shows up in an economic statistic or in a bank account deposit. It doesn't count if you spend part of your time doing something that you just love.
Yeah.
And we forget that doing things you love also tends to spur new innovation.
Yeah.
So I kind of, especially since moving back to the U.S. after living abroad for so long, and everybody in America's like, 2 weeks vacation, it's like max, they can't do anymore. And really? You really don't know how to do anything other than be at a job with an employer? It kind of like is a self-confession of a lack of creativity. Really.
No, this is fascinating, but if you don't mind, I'm going to pull out my phone and play this solitaire game that I'm getting paid to play. No,
okay.
I do actually think that a lot of what you're saying there is very accurate, right? I also think that there's, I would argue, a fundamental respect for human beings' effort regardless, right? Mm-hmm. So if I'm willing to show up and actually do creative and interesting or even just work that can't easily be done by somebody else for 15 hours, should I have a living wage associated with that?
Yeah.
And I think you and I would both say the answer is yes. But there's also a component that says, well, if that's only 15 hours, then you could do 3 of those jobs. And that's a little where we are right now.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. And this has come up a lot post-COVID. I was sitting with a guy who's about my age. And
his mid-20s, yeah.
And he was like, these young people, yeah, they're only working 15 hours a week and they're making as much as I used to make with 40. And they should be working 40.
Purchasing power adjusted, I'm not going to agree with them, but yeah. It's
and I'm kind of like, I would call that smart.
Yeah.
We should be rewarding that, right? But for him, they were lazy. There's a perception
Well,
issue.
I think both, it's interesting because both can be true, right? I mean, fundamentally, no one in their right mind is going to recreate the work experience of somebody from the 1920s, right? I show up at work, I've got a wool suit on, and I work in a poorly lit factory that doesn't have modern air conditioning. And, I roll up my sleeves and I, slam a hammer down 300 times an hour and, then go home, right? Having only worked on a non-fulfilling subcomponent of it, right? Those jobs are largely gone and I can't see them coming back. I just can't, right? I mean, the cost of human capital, particularly in the United States, and by that I literally mean the cost of human capital, makes it impossible to argue that the value added is in wielding a hammer in a commodity-oriented way and smashing it down 300 times an hour, right? Like, it just can't, that can't actually be how you use a human being today.
I'll tell you how you can, though.
Okay.
And it's close. For example, today, one of the most high-paying jobs around is in the realm of welding, and particularly underwater welding. Underwater welders get paid a fortune because robotics can't do it. It's an artisanal skill, actually. And there still are demands for artisanal skills at many things. So you can be someone who's doing manual labor. And there are other examples, so this is one of many. But it's important because right now I keep hearing from my friends, and they're like, my kid who went to study to be a lawyer can't make a living, but the one who went to be a welder is pulling home $500,000 a year. Yeah. Right? So all of our preconceptions, our assumptions about how the game works have been blown away by reality. It's not true anymore.
Well, so, it's interesting because I would argue that is an intersection of two forces, right? So when you and I, in the early 2000s went to college, it was a tiny fraction. Obviously, it was earlier than that.
It was a little earlier, yeah.
But it was a tiny fraction of the population that actually even attended college, right? So I graduated college in 1992. If I remember correctly, the statistics were something like 25% of my class, of my cohort, graduated from college. And it was actually 30% or so that even attended any college, right? The generation that came before me, those would have been statistics that made more sense for high school graduates, right? Sticking through the process and becoming a high school graduate was a relatively big deal, right? Yeah. So welders were in relatively surplus supply and college graduates were relatively short. One of the things that is clearly happening in the most recent cycles is that the relative oversupply of college-educated individuals, particularly those who have degrees that were not incentivized by the market, but instead were incentivized by student interest, right? Study what you love, become a French medieval literature major, do, XYZ studies, right? Those are fantastically oversupplied relative to the opportunity set. I was at a presentation that Bill Ackman just did on Harvard, right? And if you look at the Department of, this would be terrible when I say it, of course, but the Department of African American Studies has 57 faculty members and 1 graduate last year. One graduate last year, right? If you look at the field of computer sciences, it's about a 4-to-1 graduate to faculty member, number. I think it may have even been 6-to-1 sort of thing, right? So the productivity of the African American studies is effectively non-existent. And by the way, I don't care about African American studies. I'm actually just emphasizing there is no market signal that's coming in and saying, provide this. That is a false signal that's being created by the supply of student loan debt.
Well, and also the tenure system at universities that gave people kind of permanent employment regardless.
Yes.
And so that was also
it's hard to get rid of those 57
signal,
people,
then you can't,
right?
Yeah, you can't move on. All of this is true, but again, there's something so much bigger that's happening. And I go back to, we're going up into the far reaches of the galaxy, we're going down into the subatomic structure. So in 1945, we learned how to smash atoms together to create an incredible amount of destructive power. We used it. Bottom line is, today, what we're doing is not learning how to smash atoms, we're learning how to arrange them. Mm-hmm. And we are arranging them in ways that are generating literally millions, 2.2 million new crystals that have never been known by humanity before. 380,000 new materials discovered by Google using their new Sycamore computer alone.
All of which are going to be used by Donald Trump to decorate his new apartment, right?
Go. AlphaFold, doing all this computation with proteins and fundamentally, with DNA. And I think it's so interesting, too, that we've just discovered, because of all this new capability that we have, that DNA is not just sequential. We always thought of it, we sequence it, therefore we know what it is. No, it turns out it's three-dimensional. And the relationship of the spaces is part of the coding. Boom, whole new understanding of DNA and how it works. So what are we going to do with all these new things that we've never had before? And the answer is, whatever it is, it's going to be amazing. There are extraordinary new things that are going to happen because we have these abilities. And I suspect it's going to be the people who didn't come up through standard education who are going to say, actually, you could do it like this. And so I was in Ireland recently, meeting with some of the senior government people. They were like, we have tried for 10 years to build a children's hospital. The price tag on this thing now is something like 600 million. So they can't build a children's hospital. Meanwhile, the Chinese
it's
are
Ireland. They have so many children.
Yeah,
that's not true anymore. I know, it's not true.
Meanwhile, China is 3D printing new hospitals in a week. So why don't we do that? Oh, well, because you've got the planning permission folks, and they say, oh, well, this is all untested, and we don't know about these 3D prints. We got to use traditional labor, traditional construction methods, the tried and true. There's something coming where we're able to get past. And that's something, it's usually very hard to identify where that's going to be. But I think we can see, once we have a deal on Ukraine, Ukraine is going to become the epicenter of tech innovation, because they're going to have no choice but to say, come here and try all these methods. Use your 3D printers. We don't have planning permission people anymore. Come and build and try. And I think this is associated as well with, it won't only be Ukraine that gets rebuilt. There's going to be a need to rebuild, frankly, the Russian economy and the Chinese economy. And people are like, wait, what? They're the opponents. And I'm like, well, they're not really, right? They're part of the world economy, and you can't cancel a whole country, right? They're still going to be parts. So we got to find a way to not only end the hostilities, but bring them into the future. All of this requires using all these new methodologies, because our traditional ways of doing things aren't going to work.
So I'm very sympathetic to the point that you're making, and I agree with you that part of what we're actually seeing is this tension as the world changes, right? Yeah. So it's very similar when you start talking about, I would simply just characterize it as we're using energy, right, in concentrated manner that we've never used before. The 13th century, that concentrated manner took the form of gunpowder into church bells, so that we invented the modern cannon, changed the nature of relationships so that castles could no longer insulate you. People were forced to interact in new and unanticipated ways, right? This is not all that different. You're talking about concentrated energy sources that are now being applied to shrink down to the molecular structure, to apply processing and theoretical, problem-solving capability that could never have been coordinated in the way. as I like to point out, each individual computer chip is somewhat dumb, but you put them all together, they're able to do things in a coordinated fashion that on an individual basis we really can't do unless maybe you're Terrence Tao.
Right.
And even there, I think you would acknowledge that the simple reality is it doesn't matter how smart you are, right? You're ultimately limited. This is one of the things that we see in finance. Many of the theories that actually underpin how financial markets work that I've been very critical of largely exist because we lacked the processing power to test them 50 years ago. Now that we test them, we find them wanting. Unfortunately, exactly as you're describing in that tension, they're now embedded within the system, and we have to basically figure out, okay, how do we rip out that 19th century plumbing that's lined with lead and replace it with modern solutions that aren't going to poison us, right? So I totally agree that we're there. But one of the challenges, of course, is how do we describe and how do we identify who benefits from this, right? Because this was part of the tension that existed in the 19th century with the robber barons and the Gilded Age, as effectively, the concentration of resources and ownership of resources into a subsegment of the class meant that farmers, despite record productivity, were getting less. Right? That workers in coal mines, despite producing far more energy than anyone could have imagined 100 years before, were basically barely getting by, right? Same underlying feature today where you and I as members of a privileged class are able to pull out our phone, have a car service take us anywhere we want, have food delivered to us with absolutely no effort. And we don't have to give any thought to that because effectively these are modern slaves that we don't really have to interact with other than saying, do I give them a 20% tip? What do you think? Should I give them a 20% tip? 5-star delivery? Was it a 5-star delivery? And perversely, we actually hold their future in our hands. If I give somebody a 1-star delivery and a negative review, they could lose their job.
Sure.
With no recourse to me whatsoever.
Yeah.
Right? And so how do you think about that societal tension that then gets created? Because this, to me, feels like the big story, right? Like the rest of it is marching ahead. Yeah. And the question is, how do we reconcile that marching ahead, perhaps with who's being left behind?
Totally. So there are two specific layers of it that I'd like to address. One is there's this enormous pressure on innovators that comes from a system that doesn't want the existing infrastructure challenged. So, for example, one of the hottest issues in this presidential election has become
that's exactly where I wanted to
food.
Go. Yeah.
Right? Oh, well, the little farmers, they can't supply the nation's need because they're not efficient. Well, is that true? Or is it that those who do mass farming and like to use, glyphosate to do it more efficiently and don't count that that's a problem for the humans consuming the food, they've set up a system that's very hard to fight against. So it's not that capitalism wouldn't work. It's that we've given a huge advantage to larger corporations, and they use that advantage to keep little guys out. Nothing new, by the way, in this, but here we are again. So that's why, I keep saying it would be really nice if we tried capitalism. Yeah. We keep not trying it.
Or certainly at least enforced competitive markets.
At least enforced competitive markets. When I did my PhD, this was one of the core things that I wrote about, is that the whole purpose of trade policy and domestic competition policy is not to protect the competitors. It is to protect competition. And we've lost sight of that. And we are protecting competitors rather than competition.
Well, so I've increasingly started pointing out exactly this issue, right? So you're obviously familiar with the Bork Doctrine, which for our audience was the radical change in enforcement of antitrust that began in the 1970s, transmitted into the 1980s, fully embraced under the Reagan FTC, in which a very simple question is asked, right? Does the consumer face harm in the form of higher prices, right? Now that's that seems like a very simple test, right? And in many ways it is, and it actually does free creativity to address other components of it. But it also lends itself perfectly to monopoly, right?
Totally.
Because the really simple answer is
monopoly is taking the price
right. Well, exactly. So a monopoly produces to the average total cost. If I increase the quantity that they're manufacturing, the odds are very high that my average total cost has fallen.
Yeah.
Therefore, my price doesn't have to rise even as higher profitability accrues. But when you encounter pricing model uncertainty, when suddenly things that had been very stable, that the monopolist is like very happy to say, oh, the price is $9.99 to lease your phone, and it'll be $9.99 to lease your phone forever. And oh, by the way, don't even think about calling grandma 3 states away because the cost of long distance service is so high. That's very stable, and nobody is prepared to leave that framework. But if suddenly you introduce uncertainty and the monopolist is forced to raise prices to $20 a month, right? Then suddenly people start saying, well, what are the alternatives? How well does that 2 tin cans with a string between them actually work to transmit information? Or this new thing called the internet, or voice over IP, or all sorts of innovations that were ultimately liberated by that. You know, I can't help but point out that like Google, exactly like Xerox before it, for all its innovativeness, for all its profitability, for all its success, sat on AI for give or take 7 years until its hand was forced by the emergence of ChatGPT, right? And their whole model was, they're not ready for it yet. They're not ready for it yet, right? So I keep turning back to the counterfactual that says, wait, if we actually take the steps and we break up Google, right, and we split it into different businesses that are being forced to compete with other businesses, I don't see how we don't see a flourishing in that, you know, unobservable that currently is out there. There's so many talented, smart people at Google who are basically rest investing, as the term goes, for the very obvious reason that it just like it pays so insanely well that you would be an idiot to put it at risk.
And it's prestigious. So all the young people want to go work for this big prestigious name instead of some smaller entity that's actually needed in the economy.
And going to that prestigious place exposes you to the people who would ultimately buy your prestigious startup, right? Because you're an ex-Google engineer who started something up, therefore you've got the imprimatur. It's no different than, hey, I've got a Harvard sheepskin, right? I've got a degree that says that I'm a member of society. Nobody's ever going to, and by society, I mean high society, right? Nobody's ever going to ask my qualifications once I say, well, I went to school in Cambridge, right? Town near Boston, right? I didn't, by the way, just to be very clear. I'm one of those scrappy guys that came from the University of Pennsylvania. It is absurd. It's a qualification process. And candidly, Harvard was a finishing school for the elites. Up until the middle of the 19th century, they used to rank graduates by their social status as compared to their grades, right? This whole idea of grades and ranking people by merit didn't really even exist, right? That was much, much later. And in many ways, when you restrict the quantity of graduates as much as you have, it doesn't matter what you teach. It matters that you have the diploma, right? I've got the symbol that I'm a member of society, right? Look, I'm ranked right up here with John Quincy Adams.
So I know the sponsors that have brought us here today want us to get a little bit into the election.
Yes.
And I do think this is at the heart of it. And so it's interesting to me, people still talk about this being the left versus the right. But I don't think it is. I think it's the establishment versus the forces that want to break the establishment. And this is really important because we're at this critical moment where this fundamental question is, why are the rules set so that only the big players can win? Why isn't it that a little guy can make their way? And so this is really at the heart of all this. And I think it's also super interesting, and this is a very controversial view, but I think the big winner from this election process is Bobby Kennedy. People are like, what? He's out. What are you talking about? And I'm like, well, let's think about this. His whole thing was how to create a unity government, bring the two sides back together again and get them to hold hands and move towards the center because they'd moved to the extremes. Why? Because, they could go back, but I think that Citizens United decision that turned corporations into individuals and unrestricted all the campaign donations. And so all the members of the political class realized, I just need one billionaire who's going to give me a check for $10 million and I don't have to worry about policy, right? I just then play on Instagram, write a book, and do a book tour, which is kind of what most of them are doing, right?
Yep.
So Kennedy's like, how do we end that and bring people back in the center? Well, what's actually happened? Well, we've got Dick Cheney and Kamala Harris.
Our partners.
I'm sorry, what? They're holding hands? That sounds like a unity government to me on one side. And we have Tulsi Gabbard and Donald Trump over here. Okay, this is working. How do you get these people to talk to each other again and hold hands again? Have they moved to the center? They are moving. I'd say the left is moving into the center more. The right is moving a little more into the center. And Kennedy, while he's been, hit from every angle, and they thought he could be destroyed, but actually he will now be a candidate for 2028. And so the setup has been, it's been serious enough that it's created the biggest youth movement this country has seen
in 40 years.
Decades. He pretty much owns the under 45-year-old vote in the U.S. It's a bigger group than Obama even had.
Interesting.
And so something very profound is happening. Also, he's basically said, let's have a new party. What? And what's he done? He's founded a new party. And so, people forget, I always remind them that we're on the 6th party system in this country. And they're like, what? Yeah, we've had 5 different party systems. We used to have the Federalists and
then the Whigs
and all these
Democratic Republicans.
And then they went away, and then we had new ones. Like, we do this every now and again because politics needs to innovate too. Mm-hmm. And actually, the more innovation you get in technology and the private sector, the more politics needs to innovate. So I think we're actually on the brink of the 7th party system.
So I think you might be right on that, and I love the description that you gave as we were having this conversation offline, right? Which is effectively the establishmentarianism, and the establishmentarians and the anti-establishmentarianism.
Or, great word. One of the best words you never get to use. It's, I think, one of the longest words.
Anti-disestablishmentarianism.
Anti-disestablishmentarianism. Right. Exactly. That's a word.
Well, effectively, Kamala Harris is an anti-disestablishmentarianism, right? So what they are telling you is that the risk to the current system, the establishment system, is so high under Trump that you can't dare take the risk.
Because the whole system will break.
Right.
And the Trumpers are like, yes, exactly. So wait, what do we have here? And so what is so wrong with the current system? That's the question. And why is it people are willing to go so far to break it? And that question exists at multiple levels. You see it in lots of different ways. People in the media saying, wait, why did we take only one side? Why didn't we offer a balanced view? Or why did we give one candidate the questions in advance and not the other one? As an example. And I think this level of questioning is going to persist.
I agree. I mean, I'm watching the New York Times as it feels its way back towards the center, right? It seems to be moving at a faster pace than others.
What are they going to say if they're wrong? Whoops.
Whoops, exactly. Well, and again, you've seen this, and you go back and you look at the late 19th century, early 20th century, and the rise of yellow journalism, William Randolph Hearst, functionally identical to what we've seen with Elon Musk and Twitter. Over-levered, seeking, various embrace from moneyed interests in a variety of ways to keep things going, and therefore willing to write anything that's fit to print or not fit to print, right? So I agree that we're starting to see that change as the entities play through, and I think your characterization of this establishmentarian versus anti-establishment or anti-disestablishmentarianism is however far we want to go. We can just keep adding antis and we'll eventually get there. But this really is effectively what this election is.
That's
right?
What this is
on
about.
The left-hand side, you have actually I'm doing it wrong. So on the left-hand side, you have the establishmentarianism who say if you make any changes, the entire system is so fragile, it could break. let's not do anything. And on the right-hand side, you're having the realization of the Ben Hunt burn it all down, right? BITFD, right? That is very much saying it's not working. We need to actually change something. Now, to me, the interesting thing is how little needs to actually get burnt down.
Yeah.
But how much the choice of sacrifice actually has to be made. And I realize that, you know, in a world that has an objectivist, libertarian leaning and an Ayn Rand type framework, that idea of a moral responsibility or of making sacrifice for others feels terrifying. I mean, it really does, right? Like, you know, I'm going to give up in order that others may have more, right? That's a very scary concept, particularly in one in which you just candidly don't believe the intentions of others. And so one of the things that you and I had talked about as it relates to this election, and more broadly, is this idea of the scapegoat, right? Who's to blame?
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm increasingly drawn to this framework, right? Which is, if I look back throughout history, there is this concept of the scapegoat where society picks a random goat, right? It wasn't actually the goat's fault. The goat didn't do anything.
Exactly.
Right? But we agree that this goat represents our collective sin, all that has gone wrong for us, and we drive it from the city and we kill it. We drive out the demon, effectively. 2008, it felt clear that the bankers should have been the goat.
Do you remember who it was supposed to be?
Not
Bernie
entirely.
Madoff.
Bernie Madoff, that's
Bernie
right.
Madoff. When Bernie Madoff appeared, we went, that's it.
That's it.
He's
it's
the
his
bad
fault.
guy. But the public was actually smart enough to go, okay, bad guy.
Had nothing to do with our houses.
Kind of nothing to do with credit default swaps.
Right.
Right. Like even the general public could intuitively understand. I don't think that's the bad guy. That guy did not break into my house and steal stuff.
Not the bad guy, right?
Right,
Yeah.
not the bad guy. So there's been this unease. I remember even when I worked in the White House, when Enron happened, and we produced Sarbanes-Oxley. And the idea was CEOs had to sign for their corporate accounts and be personally responsible. And everyone was like, oh, you can't do that. All the risk-taking will stop. Bottom line is, even after that happened, there was still this sense of, I think the shark is still in the water.
Yeah.
Don't you think the shark might? It's just like in Jaws, right? They pull a shark out of the water, and it's a bloody big shark. But it's not that shark.
Yep.
It's not the shark doing the damage. We still have not found the shark.
Yeah.
We keep lifting these things out of the water saying, oh, it's this one. But people know it isn't that.
Well, and
so
part of it.
where's the shark?
Yeah, and part of it.
Who is the shark?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm actually totally serious when I say this. And so part of what we've seen this repeatedly, right? You mentioned Bernie Madoff. And then, we had obviously Trump, right?
Yeah.
For some people was a component of it. Bush at times had been it, right? Various bad bogeymans around the world, right? Saddam Hussein or whatever, right? ISIS, right? None of which actually really captured the attention. Now, half the population basically thinks that Trump is the reason why things are bad, right? And would love to cast him out.
That's right.
And the other half is looking at him like, oh, this is
the only guy
prophet,
who can fix
right?
it.
This is not the scapegoat. This is the prophet.
Yes.
One, I think you and I have discussed this framework, and so like you're seeing a lot of the same stuff. Like eventually we have to figure out who we're going to blame.
Yeah.
Right. And we almost joke about it, right? In that, like Epstein, right? What does he stand for? The globalists, pedophiles of the world united in a cabal conspiracy, now carried over to Puff Daddy, and we're completely convinced that anyone sitting in a cell with him is destined to be offed alongside him. So Sam Bankman-Fried better watch out, right? Like, but it does feel like we need that scapegoat. Who is it? Who's your bet? Because you were right when you talked about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Emerging as one of the heroes coming through this cycle.
Yeah.
Neil Howe of life cycle fame and the generations type framework, the fourth turning, argues that the hero will emerge, right? And many people struggle with his definition of the millennials as heroes. I will tell you that candidly, I'm actually increasingly convinced he's right on that. I think by the definition of hero, he's actually talking about somebody who makes the hard choices.
Yeah.
And says, we will sacrifice X in order to save Y. Right?
Well, this is one of humanity's oldest stories.
Rituals,
The old story. It is the story of King Arthur and the Round Table. It's the
Gilgamesh.
story of
it's the story
Gilgamesh.
Of
it
Jesus,
is the story of Jesus.
Right.
And it is the story, and the answer in all these stories is always the same. As long as the hero character keeps asking for things for himself, the kingdom is lost.
Yeah.
It's only when the hero starts to ask what is needed for the others that the kingdom is saved.
Yeah.
And so we're back to what we started with at the beginning of this, which is ask not what you can do. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Today, is it for your country? I think it's not, because especially for younger people, borders, whatever, they don't really have any meaning. What does that mean to have borders? Even I spend my life bopping around the world. I take airplanes like other people take a bus or a taxi because it's a small world to me and I'm working on a global scale. So this idea of the national rules and adherence to the nation doesn't have the resonance that it used to. Look at Sam Altman, for example, when he's just trying to get to the most advanced artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence. So he doesn't care whether the data is from China and the Middle East. He just wants to get there. And when I think the U.S. authorities realized that he was doing deals with China and the Middle East, next thing you know, he's fired. Mm-hmm. Then his 700 plus employees go, well, I'm going with him. Wherever he can do this anywhere in the world. And next thing you know, he's hired again and they end up with Larry Summers on the board. Almost like, well, we got to have an official there to keep an eye on what these kids are up to.
Right.
Okay.
the Eric Schmidt for OpenAI.
Exactly.
Got to have an adult in the room.
You got to have an adult in the room, an adult which has the national interest as their priority.
And honestly, who can you think of who has the national interest as their priority more than Larry Summers?
There's Larry Summers.
He would never work for self-glorification. It's really all about country for Larry, right?
Well, but let's face it, if you wanted someone to report back to the system, that would be a very reliable person.
That's a person who would definitely hightail it to the establishment and say,
okay, here's what's going on.
Yeah.
Now, by the way, why is this really, really important right now? It gets to the heart of a very big question in the realm of artificial intelligence and innovation, which Andreessen and Horowitz recently revealed in a really interesting little clip video that they did. So they went to a meeting in the White House on AI, and they got people from the intelligence and defense establishment in the meeting. Basically, the White House guys go, we can't have some teenager creating some AI that's going to radically affect all our lives. And Andreessen and Horowitz were like, well, that's what is happening, and you can't really regulate this because it's algorithms. And the White House team or the defense folks, they basically go, no. We got to regulate this. And they said, well, but that means you're going to have to classify math, which of course you can't do. They start laughing. The other guys are not laughing, and they say, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to classify math so that a teenager cannot build these new radically impactful AIs. And they're like, and then the defense establishment rightly says, in 1945, when we created the atom bomb, we built a kind of invisible Berlin Wall. If you wanted to do certain kinds of physics, you couldn't do it. If you'd have to join the establishment, join government, and work in a government lab. If you tried to do it in your garage, we'd arrest you. And if you tried to do it, in an academic institution, we'd make sure you get no funding. And I think, by the way, this is one reason, I'm working on a nuclear fusion project at the moment. Why has nuclear fusion not advanced? Well, partly because the Berlin Wall is sitting there that don't allow people to cross it and do that research unless you're inside the right structure. So, bottom line is the innovators are going to keep going, and they have the tools to do it. They don't need to be in a government lab. In fact, that would be the last place probably now where you're going to get the most cutting edge stuff. And if we try to classify math and build a new invisible Berlin Wall, see, the thing is it could work in 1950. But today we have this little thing called the internet. And everyone has more computational power in their pocket than we needed to get a human to the moon in the first place. And they know how to use it. So you can't do it like this. If we do that, the talent will leave and it will build this stuff. By the way, when I say leave, it doesn't have to get on a plane, because now you can build a company with the brightest people in the world remotely, and you're all talking to each other, you know, on Zoom. So you don't need to all be in one place, not in one country, not in one jurisdiction. Back to the borders are not so meaningful. So now what this really means, we got to think about what's the national interest? What is it we're asking people to pledge to? You know, the American flag, what does it stand for? If it stands for the ability to reinvent yourself from nobody to somebody, people can believe in that. Mm-hmm. But if you set the whole system up so that a nobody cannot become a somebody, they don't believe in that. So that's why I go back to, I think if we have to really rethink who we're giving opportunity to and where we're barring the door because we're aligned with the profits, so we don't want to give that up. And so maybe the question is, what profits would I give away to another in order to have a more stable, better society? True capitalists understand that is a normal part of the calculus. Current capitalists seem to be of the opinion that it's only about money, there are no externalities, and my only goal is to make the maximum amount of money regardless of the consequences for anybody else, including if my product causes cancer or, you know, whatever. And I think that's where fundamentally we get down to ethics and ethos, which is so old-fashioned. Mm-hmm. But that's at the heart of the matter we're discussing.
Yeah, I think that I would 100% agree with that discussion, right? I find myself, as I progress further through my career, increasingly finding myself thinking about the questions that were tried, that, you know, the university tried to introduce to me in 1988. Yeah. Things like stakeholder capitalism, right? The assumptions that underpin a productive possibilities frontier. I would just put, you know, the line that I would use for people is, you know, remember, what is the mother of invention? Necessity, right? And so when we have a subset of the population that truly has no necessity, right, that is unbounded in their access to resources and potential, you may find they are creative as they desire to be, but there is no necessity associated with that. You're actually seeing a sizable fraction of the population, and, you know, we talk about these wonderful innovations and everything else. On the flip side of that equation, I posted on Twitter the other day that the city of Baltimore's school system, with 75,000 students in the high school system, had 0 students that were proficient at grade level math. 0. Right? And so you can come to a statement that says, well, that's a byproduct of a subpopulation. Statistically impossible, actually. It proves the exact opposite. Right? The school system, I don't care how you want to orient the IQ center of the population, simple standard deviation would say the idea that 0 get through that process is statistically impossible unless the system is actively set up to drive failure, right? Which it is. Like, that's where we are in this process. And so we need to somehow or other figure out, how do we actually transmit some of the resources from that class that has unlimited resources at this point. And it doesn't have to be, by the way, this is the paradox, it doesn't have to be all of them, right? Yeah. We go around these nonsense declarations of, if every billionaire were to be taxed at 100% and all their wealth came in, it would only be X% of the US government. It's like, well, wait a second. Let's be really clear what we're talking about in terms of the unsustainability of the current system. We're talking about 5% budget deficits, right? We're not actually talking about the entirety of funding the U.S. government, right? So very modest changes can actually have a meaningful impact. But people understandably, and very understandably, are able to look at the current system and say it's not working.
It's not working.
It's not working. And so I would argue that there are a couple of things that I would take away from this. One is this is increasingly not a problem of economics in terms of the organizational efficiency of organizations themselves, the control theory around how do I manage a company that has 100 employees versus 1,000 employees. We've effectively solved many of those problems, certainly at the scale that we're trying to do stuff. Now the questions are really about how do we come together and heal as a society?
Yes.
What are the sacrifices that we need to make the collective outcome better, as frustrating as that sounds, right? And as a capitalist, I want to be very, very clear. I understand. I sound like a raging communist. I'm not in the least. I actually very much just think that we're in a situation right now where we have somewhat improperly framed the problem.
So this is where we get from your idea of a scapegoat to the idea I've talked to you about, which is forgiveness.
Yeah.
And I mean financial forgiveness as well as other kinds of forgiveness. And like you, I grew up, hardcore capitalist, mainly leaning Republican, very interested in the entrepreneurial instinct and pursued that myself. But throughout the course of human history, we have had periods where the level of debt built up to such an extent that it could not be serviced. There was no way to earn your way out of it. And so societies introduced forgiveness, right? The Sumerians, the Babylonians, 7 years, and then boom, slate clean, everybody starts again. No one can imagine that happening today. And yet, interestingly, the White House is like forgiving student loans because they were the most onerous of the debt forms that young people faced. So it is happening even today. But I'm talking about something even bigger. And so this is something, you've heard me talk about this before, but when the level of debt gets so big that you can't pay it off, there is no amount of work that's ever going to pay this off. And now we have this globally. China has a level of debt that can't be paid off. The Americans have a level of debt that can't be paid off. Europe can't be paid off, collectively, which kind of raises the question, where did all the money go? Who has it if everybody else is in debt?
Baby boomers.
Yeah. Then there is one other solution. But there are all these different solutions. You can say, I'm just defaulting, I'll never pay you back. Pretty ugly outcome. But you can also say, I'll pay you back, but a little bit later, a little bit less. That's the Greek style haircut, but nobody calls it a default. It's just a restructuring. You can say, okay, we're going to turn the pain inward, and so we'll default on the citizens on the promises that we've made. So you can't retire at 65. It's going to be like 80 or whatever. These are all vote losers. And then there's inflation. And actually, that's the road that we've chosen. And everyone denies it and excoriates anyone who suggests that this was a choice. But it was. We chose to go to zero interest rates and throw a lot of money around because a little inflation would get us out of the problem that we were in when the financial crisis happened. But inflation creates pain, too. So there is a final option. And it's where I think we're going to end up. And that is, you can just abandon the whole system of money and accounting and introduce a new one. And everyone goes, no, you can't. And you go, yeah, you can. And so we last did this in 1834 when the British moved from using a system of wooden boards broken in half called tally sticks. And the shorter end of the stick was your record of all your tax payments and assets you own. And the longer one went back to the chancellor to keep a record of the economy. And so it was a highly personalized record. And then the debt from many wars built up, and there was no way to inflate with the tally stick system. It takes too long for the tree to grow, too long for the life of the record keeping to happen. So they said, we're going to introduce a new technology called paper money. And people were like, I'm not giving up my tally sticks with all my ID on it for a piece of paper that doesn't have my name on it. So they said, okay, we'll take the tally sticks to Parliament. We're going to burn them, so you can't use them. And that threw off so much heat that Parliament burned down, literally, right? That was the destruction of the system of money and accounting and the introduction of a new one. So today, what are we getting? Very interesting in the presidential race. We get a lot of talk about Bitcoin. Maybe we should legalize Bitcoin, and maybe these crypto tokenized instruments ought to be legalized. Why? Not because everybody changed their morals about this. It's like marijuana. Why did we make it legal? It's not that you wake up one morning going, well, I think it's a good idea. No, because if you make it legal, you could tax it. So revenue streams, same thing. If you take the whole Bitcoin economy and crypto economy and you bring it into the legal economy, that's a big addition to GDP and what is going on in the world, right?
I'm not sure I agree with you on that, but that's okay.
And also it puts light onto the black economy.
It does put light on the black market
so you can shut that down. So what has the talk been? That, and the U.S. has ended up as an extremely large owner of Bitcoin, mainly through confiscation, which is fascinating. And so, if you confiscate a few $1 billion worth of Bitcoin from some drug-dealing enterprise and you're the Department of Justice, that pays for your budget for like decades. Maybe we want that to be useful in some way. That's connected to, if you're young and you create a business now, do you have to incorporate it in a country? Or can you create smart contracts and you have people all over the world and actually you start to think, all right, could we tokenize this? So you don't issue debt and you don't issue equity, you issue tokens. I think that we're heading in this direction of a dramatic innovation in the definition of money itself. And the accounting system, not blockchain because it's too slow, but Hedera hash graph is maybe a better example. It doesn't work because it's closed, not an open technology. But the point is, we now know we can start to store data and information much more profoundly than ever before. And in fact, by the way, DNA is turning out to be the greatest information storage mechanism of all. And we're starting to learn how to work with DNA to store data. Very interesting. And by the way, that doesn't need refrigeration. So suddenly power draw AI can be fixed if you start to use like neuromorphic chips, brain cells on chips, which is already a thing. Taken together, what I'm describing is a radical shift into a much more productive future. And just as in 1834, when we got rid of the old system of money and accounting, far from falling apart, that set the stage for the incredible growth period of the Industrial Revolution. And I think as we begin to get more comfortable with these new instruments, new ways of thinking about risk and its management, we may be setting the stage for a period of growth that will dwarf what we saw in the Industrial Revolution. But it will not be the same kind of money or the same kind of accounting that got us into the mess we're in right now.
So this is going to be a fantastic discussion for you and I to continue at dinner.
It is.
I can hear it clicking in the background. Pippa, as always, this was a blast. It was a really, really fun time to sit down and talk with you about this. Everything ranging from, scapegoats to tally sticks to forgiveness. And I would echo almost everything that you had said. I do think that we are at this momentum point in history. And I think it was Kipling, who used the phrase, right, struggling to be born, right? Somebody, something new is struggling to be born. Yeah. To me, that is one of the clearest feelings that's out there. I'm not sure what it is. I'm not sure I'm going to like it. I'm an increasingly old man, so I probably won't. But the simple reality is that it's going to be, I might like it a lot. It may very well be a world that is very different than the one that we have dealt with for a very long time. And I think that, to me, feels more like anything else is the really key takeaway. Let's continue this conversation at dinner. We'll get away from the mosquitoes in the pool and move on to the next.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Amazing.